Benny has since compared the whole process to something almost mythical. Long before four Swedes stood on a Eurovision stage and changed pop music forever, there was a 6-year-old in the Vasasten district of Stockholm, pushing the buttons of an accordion his father and grandfather had just bought him. Göran Breer Benny Andersson was born on December 16, 1946, to a civil engineer named Gösta and his wife Leila. And from the very start, music in the Andersson household wasn't a hobby chosen. It was a family language passed down. His father Gösta and his grandfather Ephraim both played accordion, and they taught young Benny Swedish folk tunes and traditional songs long before he ever touched a piano. That came at age 10, when he got an instrument of his own and simply taught himself to play it, picking out melodies by ear the way some children pick up a second language without trying. By 15, Benny had left school behind to perform in youth clubs around Stockholm. He joined a group called Ulverket Spelmanslag, mostly instrumental, and it was there he wrote his first tentative songs. What's striking, looking back at this part of his life, is how ordinary and unglamorous it all was. There was no premonition of global fame, no sense that this kid with the accordion would one day co-write some of the most recognized melodies in the history of recorded music. What we now think we always suspected, that Benny's musical instincts were shaped by structure and discipline, not spectacle, turns out to be exactly true, and it's confirmed by the driest kind of evidence: a documented, unremarkable childhood spent practicing. In October 1964, Benny joined the Hep Stars as keyboardist, and the band quickly became the biggest thing in Swedish pop. Journalists later nicknamed them the Swedish Beatles. Benny was, by every account, a teen idol in his own country, and he started writing songs for the group, including early hits like Sunny Girl and Wedding. It was good training. It taught him what a hook sounded like, what made an audience of screaming teenagers stop screaming for 3 minutes and listen. Then, on June 5, 1966, something happened that Benny still describes with obvious fondness decades later. He was driving to a gig when a car came toward him down a narrow country road. Inside was a member of a folk group called the Hootenanny Singers, a young man named Björn Ulvaeus. "We wound down our windows and said, 'Hi, nice to meet you,'" Andersson has recalled, and the two arranged to meet again that same evening. Sitting around with guitars, one of them suggested they try writing something together. That casual suggestion, made by two young Swedish musicians who had no idea what they were starting, became the foundation of one of the most successful songwriting partnerships in pop history. Benny left the Hep Stars in August 1969 after a stretch of financial trouble and musical disagreements within the band, and by then his creative energy had already shifted toward his work with Björn. In 1969, he also met a singer named Annie Fridlingstad, known to the world as Frida, and the following year, he and Björn released their first joint album, Lycka, with their girlfriends, Frida and Agnetha Faltskog, providing backing vocals. The four people who would become ABBA were already, in a sense, orbiting each other before the band had a name. There's a persistent myth about songwriting, that inspiration strikes suddenly, usually at some ungodly hour of the night, and the artist simply channels it. Benny has said plainly that both he and Björn quickly realized this was nonsense. Waiting around for a lightning bolt of inspiration is a good way to never finish a song. Instead, their process was almost blue-collar in its discipline. Benny at the piano or whatever keyboard was within reach, Björn beside him with a guitar, the two of them playing chords, humming half-formed melodies, tossing fragments back and forth until something caught. As their partnership matured, the division of labor became clear. Benny supplied the music. Björn increasingly took over the lyrics, refining and editing the ideas that came pouring out of his songwriting partner. Waiting, he said, is like waiting for a dragon to come out of the cave. He's pointed out that during ABBA's roughly 10 years together, the group recorded close to 100 songs, which works out to about 10 finished songs a year, achieved only because they worked at it nearly every day rather than touring constantly. That, in Benny's own account, is precisely why ABBA toured so rarely at their commercial peak. The band needed the studio time to let the process work, to let the dragon eventually show itself. This detail matters because so much of the mythology around ABBA's sound treats it as effortless pop confection, glittering and disposable. The reality, confirmed by the man who wrote the music, is the opposite, obsessive, repetitive, deliberate labor, built one chord change at a time. Benny has also said he finds it strange that so many contemporary hit songs are credited to committees of 6 or 8 writers, since for him, a song has always started with a single idea, a melody paired with chords, built outward from there. It's a small comment, but it says a great deal about how differently he sees his own craft compared to how pop music is often made today. While Agnetha and Frida became the faces most audiences associated with ABBA, captured in the tabloids, photographed at premieres, discussed in terms of style and rivalry, Benny and Björn were, in the language of the era, the men behind the music. That's not speculation or a modern reinterpretation. It was a role they were assigned by the press almost from the start, and one both men have discussed candidly in later interviews and documentaries about the group's history. What Benny actually built in the studio, though, went well beyond writing melodies. ABBA was known for embracing new technology early, among the first Swedish acts to acquire a mini Moog synthesizer, among the first to experiment seriously with multi-track recording. Björn has recalled that the pair always wanted the latest thing, constantly asking how a particular sound on a record had been achieved, and then chasing down the equipment to do it themselves. That restless curiosity is part of why ABBA's records still sound layered and considered 50 years later, rather than dated the way so much of 1970s pop has become. Frida herself has spoken about how the vocal range she shared with Agnetha shaped what Benny was able to write, nearly 3 octaves between them, she's noted, which gave Benny room to compose more demanding, more ambitious melodies than a single voice would have allowed. Benny has said as much himself. Once he stopped writing for ABBA, he found it difficult to write for a different, more limited voice, because he'd spent a decade composing for an instrument that particular and that flexible. It's a rare admission of just how specifically Benny's songwriting was built around the 4 people in the room, not some abstract formula for a hit. Benny and Frida were a couple by the time ABBA formed in the early 1970s, and they married in 1978. Björn and Agnetha, who had married in 1971 with Benny playing the organ at their wedding, divorced first in 1980. Benny and Frida's marriage ended shortly after, with the divorce announced in February 1981. Frida later told biographer Carl Magnusbaum that she didn't know exactly what had gone wrong, that it might have been the strain of constantly working together, never carving out separate time for their private lives, never sitting down as 2 individuals to decide what they actually wanted. ABBA took a great part of our lives, she said. Benny, for his part, gave a rare and visibly uncomfortable interview not long. The split, in which he admitted he didn't know how other people coped with something like this. He and Frida were still bandmates, still on friendly terms. We are just not partners in marriage any longer, he said at the time. He had, by then, begun a relationship with Mona Norklit, a Swedish TV presenter he would go on to marry that November, in 1981. They remain married today and have one son, Ludwig. What's notable is that both divorces happened while ABBA was still technically an active band, and the group did try to continue recording afterward. But by most accounts, the well of collective creative energy had genuinely started to run dry rather than collapsing in one dramatic argument. There wasn't a single blowout or a headline-grabbing falling out. The band members simply stopped actively working together after 1982, and the split was formally acknowledged in 1983 without much public ceremony. It was less an explosion than a slow loss of momentum for people who had built something extraordinary together, and who then, one at a time, stepped quietly away from it. Whatever exhaustion Benny felt at the end of ABBA, it clearly didn't extinguish his appetite for composing. Between 1982 and 1984, working with Björn and lyricist Tim Rice, he wrote the music for the stage musical Chess, which opened in London in 1986 and ran for roughly 3 years. In 1987, he released his first solo album, Klinga Mina Klockor, made in collaboration with the folk ensemble Orsa Spelman, returning openly to the accordion-driven Swedish folk music of his childhood rather than the polished pop of ABBA. A second solo record, November 1989, followed 2 years later. In 1995, Benny and Björn premiered Kristina Fran de Vemela, a Swedish-language musical based on Vilhelm Moberg's novels about 19th-century emigration from Sweden to America. It became a major success at home and was later staged in English in both New York and London. Then came Mamma Mia, the jukebox musical built around ABBA's own catalog, which turned into one of the most commercially successful stage shows ever produced, followed by a 2008 film adaptation that became the most successful film musical of its era, with Benny personally involved in re-recording the songs for the soundtrack. Since 2001, Benny has also performed regularly with his own 16-piece band, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, often alongside vocalists Helen Sjöholm and Tommy Körberg, playing a mix of original material and Swedish folk-influenced songs. Work that has little to do with global pop stardom and everything to do with the kind of music he grew up on as a boy with an accordion. It's arguably the clearest evidence of who Benny actually is once the machinery of a supergroup is removed. Someone who never really stopped being interested in melody, structure, and craft for their own sake. More recently, Benny and Frida have reunited publicly around ABBA Voyage, the digital avatar concert built in a custom arena in East London, where the band appears as painstakingly rendered digital versions of their younger selves performing to live audiences. Speaking together to promote a new phase of that project, both offered some of their most candid reflections, yet on what it actually felt like to make ABBA's music, and on where things stand between them now. Frida has said the two remain friends even though they now live in different countries. She outside Sweden, the rest of the group still there. And Benny, at 79, has said he still sits down at the piano every day trying to write, though he's honest that the dragon comes out of the cave far less often than it used to. The inspiration, when it does arrive, comes from hearing himself stumble onto something he's never played before and simply liking the sound of it. That's it. No mystical process, no hidden formula, just an old songwriter still doing the same unglamorous, patient work he was doing as a teenager in Elverket Spelmanslag, 60 years earlier. So what has Benny Andersson actually confirmed, in his own words, across decades of interviews, rather than in any single dramatic confession? That ABBA's music was built through discipline, not magic. Through nearly 100 songs written over roughly 10 working years, not sudden bursts of inspiration. That the sound the world associates with effortless pop joy was, behind the scenes, obsessive and exacting. Refined take after take until it matched a feeling he was chasing. That the personal cost of the band's success was real. 2 marriages that didn't survive the pressure of constant collaboration and constant scrutiny, but that the professional partnerships, remarkably, mostly did. And that even now, well into his 70s, the thing that first pulled a 6-year-old boy toward an accordion in Stockholm hasn't actually gone anywhere. It's the same instinct, still showing up at the piano, still waiting patiently for the next good idea to appear. That's not a scandal, and it was never really a secret. It's just a plain, well-documented shape of one songwriter's working life, which, it turns out, is exactly what most of us suspected all along.